The biggest mistake we made with From was assuming the town's mystery began with the monsters. It didn't. The monsters were never the beginning of the story. They were the result of it. And Season 4 finally gives us enough pieces to see what the show has been hiding in plain sight. The people trapped in From are not simply victims of a supernatural place. They are living inside a story that has already happened before. Again, and again, and again. The terrifying part is that some of them have been here before. They just forgot. Look at what happens when Jade and Tabitha finally begin connecting the bottle tree to the children and to their own strange history. The revelation is not simply that they have some supernatural connection to the town. The implication is much worse. Their connection appears to be part of a repeating pattern. Jade has lived through versions of this story before. Tabitha has too. And if that is true, then almost every major event we watched across the first 3 seasons has to be viewed differently. Because what if the town doesn't trap random people? What if it selects people who can continue the story? That changes everything. For years, we thought the central mystery was simple. Who built this place? Why can't anyone leave? Where did the monsters come from? What do the trees mean? Why does the town keep producing impossible events? But here's what changes everything. Those might not be separate mysteries. They may all be consequences of one forgotten event. One original story. A story involving children, sacrifice, immortality, and a promise that was never fulfilled. And Season 4 quietly moves that story from the background to the center of the mythology. Think about the children. They have always been the emotional core of From's mystery. We saw them in the underground tunnels. We saw Tabitha being drawn toward them. We saw Jade witnessing visions connected to the past. And eventually, the show reveals that the children were not simply random supernatural victims. Something was done to them. Something so terrible that it became the foundation of everything surrounding the town. That is why the bottle tree matters. That is why the reincarnation revelations matter. And that is why the story keeps returning to the same symbols. The town is not merely haunted by the past. The town is built around it. And this is where it gets darker. What if the monsters are not the original evil? What if they are the survivors of the original bargain? Season 4 makes that possibility almost impossible to ignore. The creatures are no longer presented as simple predators wandering around at night. Their behavior, their transformation, their relationship with Fatima, and their connection to this strange mythology surrounding the children suggests something much more deliberate. They are part of a system with rules, a system that can be disturbed, and most importantly, a system that reacts when the residents start remembering. That last part may be the key, because whenever someone gets too close to the truth, the town pushes back. Jade sees things. Tabitha remembers things. Julie develops the ability to move through moments in the story. Sarah hears voices that seem to know more than she does. Victor has spent decades surrounded by memories he couldn't fully understand. And Ethan keeps drawing images that look like pieces of the same mythology. These aren't disconnected supernatural abilities. They may be different ways of accessing the same buried story. That is the detail everyone missed. The town doesn't only erase people's memories. It replaces understanding with fragments. A drawing here, a vision there, a symbol, a voice, a tree, a child, a nightmare, a person appearing in a form that should be impossible. The residents receive pieces, but almost never the complete picture.
Why?
Because remembering the entire story may be dangerous. Look at Victor. For decades, Victor survived by forgetting. Not because he wanted to, because his mind adapted to the impossible. He buried memories. He separated events from their meaning. He collected objects. He drew pictures. He remembered details without understanding how they connected. And that may be exactly what the town wants. Fragments are harmless. A complete memory is not. Because once you understand the story, you can challenge the rules. And Season 4 shows exactly what happens when the residents begin doing that. Boyd doesn't want to accept the town's logic anymore. Jade wants to understand the mechanism. Tabitha wants to reach the children. Julie begins learning that time itself may not be as fixed as everyone believes. And the town responds. Not with an explanation. With escalation. That's not the real mystery. The real mystery is why the town needs everyone confused. If the residents are simply prisoners, confusion makes sense. But if they are participants in a repeating story, confusion becomes necessary. Because the moment the characters recognize their roles, the cycle becomes vulnerable. And this gives us a completely different interpretation of Jade and Tabitha. Maybe they aren't simply two people who happen to share a connection with the past. Maybe they are recurring pieces of the same story. Different bodies, different lives, same positions, same unfinished purpose. And that would explain why their visions feel less like memories and more like echoes. The people change. The story doesn't. This is exactly why Season 4's revelations about Jade's previous incarnations are so important. Jade doesn't simply discover that he has been connected to the town before. He begins seeing the consequences of those previous lives. And suddenly, his obsession with solving the mystery looks different. Maybe Jade isn't discovering the mystery for the first time. Maybe he's remembering it. That's a terrifying distinction. Because if Jade has tried to solve this before, then his current attempt may already have a predetermined ending. He thinks he's investigating the puzzle. But perhaps the puzzle is investigating him. And then there is Tabitha. Her connection to the children has always felt different from everyone else's. She doesn't merely see them. She responds to them emotionally. She is pulled toward the places connected to them. And Season 4 pushes that connection even further. If Tabitha has been part of the cycle before, then her desire to save the children may not be a new decision. It may be an old promise. A promise that keeps surviving even when the person making it doesn't remember making it. That could explain why the town keeps bringing the same kinds of people back into the same nightmare. Because the story is unfinished. The children were not saved. The original sacrifice did not produce the ending someone expected. The bargain created something else. And the consequences became the town. Now the residents are trapped inside the aftermath. But here's the terrifying possibility. What if the town isn't trying to stop them from escaping? What if it is trying to force them to finish the story? That would explain why escape attempts constantly lead back to deeper revelations. The road doesn't simply return them to the town physically. It returns them to the mythology. Every attempt to leave exposes another layer of the past. Every answer creates another connection. Every breakthrough reveals that the residents were never standing outside the mystery. They were inside it. And that means the title of this theory, The Story Everyone Forgot, isn't just about forgotten memories. It may be the actual mechanism of from. The story survives because the people inside it forget. And the moment they remember, the story changes. Which brings us to the most disturbing question of all. If Jade and Tabitha are remembering previous lives, who else is remembering? Because if the cycle requires certain people to return, then there may be characters in the town who already know exactly what is happening. They just aren't telling anyone. And one character has been surrounded by this story longer than almost anyone else. Victor. For decades, Victor has been drawing the same nightmare. The trees, the tunnels, the children, the people, the impossible events. But maybe Victor's drawings aren't random memories. Maybe they are the surviving pages of the original story. And if that's true, then Victor may not simply be the town's oldest witness. He may be the person who has been carrying the missing chapter all along. And the reason he couldn't explain it may be because he was never supposed to remember the ending. Because once the ending is remembered, the cycle can finally be broken. Or something far worse can happen. Because if From has been repeating one story for generations, then the residents aren't just trying to escape a town. They're trying to escape a narrative. And narratives have rules. Rules that the town has followed for decades. Rules that the monsters understand. Rules that the children understand. Rules that Jade and Tabitha are only now beginning to remember. And if those rules are real, then the final mystery isn't who controls From. It's this: who wrote the story in the first place? And why does the story still need new people to play it? But if the story has happened before, then one question becomes impossible to ignore. Why does nobody remember the first time? That may be the single most important rule in From. The people trapped inside the town remember their lives. They remember their families. They remember where they came from. But when it comes to the supernatural history surrounding the town, their memories become fragmented. Not completely erased. Fragmented. And there is a difference. Because erased memories disappear. Fragments remain. A photograph. A drawing. A symbol. A recurring dream. A strange feeling that a place has been visited before. A face that feels familiar even though it shouldn't. That is exactly how the town appears to preserve its victims. It doesn't need them to remember everything. It only needs enough of the past to survive. And this is where Victor becomes much more important. For most of the story, Victor looks like a survivor who simply endured the nightmare longer than anyone else. But what if he is actually something closer to a living archive? Think about how Victor behaves. He doesn't trust memories. He collects objects. He hides information. He draws. He avoids certain subjects. And when something reminds him of the past, his reaction is often immediate and emotional before he can even explain why. That's not how someone behaves when they simply remember a traumatic childhood. That's how someone behaves when their mind is trying to protect them from something it already knows. Victor may have spent decades forgetting the same story, but his drawings refuse to forget. And that is why his drawings matter so much. They don't explain the town. They preserve it. The images function almost like pieces of a memory that survived when the conscious mind didn't. And once you look at them that way, the drawings stop being mysterious decoration. They become evidence. Evidence that the town has been repeating patterns long before Boyd ever arrived. And if Victor's drawings preserve the past, then Jade's visions may represent something different. They may be the process of remembering. Jade is obsessed with patterns because his mind cannot accept meaningless coincidence. He sees symbols and wants an explanation. He sees the bottle tree and immediately tries to understand its function. He sees historical imagery and connects it to the present. But his greatest mistake may be assuming that he is discovering something external. What if the information is coming from inside him? What if Jade's obsession isn't curiosity? What if it is recognition? That would explain why his visions feel so personal. And it would explain why the town seems almost desperate to overwhelm him whenever he gets close. Because a person who is merely investigating can be distracted. A person who is remembering is much harder to stop. Now look at the bottle tree. For a long time, the tree looked like another supernatural object. A strange landmark. A method of communication. A doorway. But the deeper meaning may be much simpler. The tree represents memory. Every bottle contains something from a person. A number. A date. A message. A fragment. Something preserved. And that is exactly what the entire town does. It preserves fragments of people. The residents arrive. They disappear. Their stories become part of the town. Their memories become clues. Their deaths become warnings. Their experiences become visions for the next generation. The tree doesn't simply connect locations. It connects stories. And this is where the theory becomes dangerous. Because if the bottle tree represents preserved memory, then the farway tree may not simply transport people through space. It may transport them through the story itself. That's why its destination cannot always be predicted. The characters think they are moving from one place to another. But perhaps they are moving between different points in the town's history. That would explain why the rules seem inconsistent. One person enters a tree and emerges somewhere unexpected. Another experiences something that appears connected to another time. Julie discovers that time may not behave normally. And suddenly, the strange trees stop looking like random supernatural transportation devices. They become narrative shortcuts. The town doesn't operate like normal geography. It operates like memory. And memory is not linear. You can remember childhood before remembering yesterday. A smell can transport you decades into the past. A face can trigger something you didn't know you had forgotten. A place can feel familiar without any rational explanation. From has been behaving exactly like that. The town is not a map. It's a memory. And the people inside it are moving through someone else's trauma. But whose? This is where the children become the center of everything. Because the children are the one part of the mythology that doesn't fit the simple monster town explanation. They aren't attacking people. They aren't hunting Boyd. They aren't trying to feed. They are trapped. They appear terrified. And they keep trying to communicate.
Why?
Because they may be the original victims. The first people who were forgotten. The first people whose story became the foundation of the town. And if the theory is correct, the monsters are connected to that original tragedy. Not necessarily as its creators, as its consequences. That changes the meaning of their immortality. Maybe the monsters weren't granted eternal life as a reward. Maybe they were transformed by the original bargain. Maybe the people who sacrificed the children believed they could escape death. And instead, they became trapped in a different form of existence. They survived, but they stopped being human. That would explain the disturbing calmness of the monsters. They don't behave like animals.
They talk.
They manipulate. They recognize human weaknesses. They understand fear. They sometimes appear almost nostalgic. That isn't random. It may be the remnant of who they used to be. And this is where the story becomes horrifying. What if the monsters aren't trying to kill the residents because they hate them? What if they're trying to make them understand? The monsters repeatedly play with their victims. They talk before attacking. They wait. They manipulate. They create emotional situations. That behavior makes no sense if their only purpose is feeding. But it makes much more sense if the town is forcing people through a psychological ritual. Fear isn't just entertainment. Fear is part of the process. The residents must suffer. They must lose people. They must break. They must become desperate. Because desperation creates choices. And choices recreate the original story. Look at Boyd. The town constantly pushes him into impossible decisions. Save one person or another. Risk himself or protect the group. Trust someone or suspect them. Go outside the rules or obey them. Every decision creates consequences. And those consequences create more suffering. The same thing happens to Tabitha. The same thing happens to Jade. The same thing happens to Victor. The same thing happens to everyone who becomes important to the mystery. The town doesn't simply attack their bodies. It attacks their relationships. Because relationships create choices. And choices create the story. That may be why the monsters rarely behave like ordinary predators. They aren't just hunting bodies. They are manipulating narratives. And once you understand that, the deaths throughout From become much darker. Maybe every death is part of the cycle. Maybe every tragedy pushes the survivors toward the same emotional positions occupied by people in the original story. Someone becomes the protector. Someone becomes the skeptic. Someone becomes the believer. Someone becomes the sacrifice. Someone becomes the person trying to save the children. Someone becomes the person willing to make a terrible bargain. The names change. The roles remain. And that would explain why certain character relationships feel strangely repetitive. The town keeps recreating the same psychological pattern. It needs a Boyd. It needs a Tabitha. It needs a Jade. It needs someone like Victor. And it may need someone to fail. Because the story cannot continue unless the characters reach the same unresolved point. That is why escape has always felt impossible. The road is not the prison. The cycle is the prison. And this is the major reframe. The residents aren't trapped because the town has no exit. They are trapped because the story has no ending. The moment someone tries to leave, the narrative pulls them back. The moment someone discovers a clue, another mystery appears. The moment someone reaches the children, something interrupts them. The moment someone thinks they understand the rules change. Not because the writers are simply hiding information, but because the characters themselves may be approaching the point where the original story broke. And if they reach that point, they may finally discover what happened. Or repeat it. This is why Tabitha's connection to the children could be more dangerous than anyone realizes. If she is repeating the role of someone from the original story, then saving the children may not automatically free everyone. It may be the exact action that previously caused the cycle to continue. That possibility completely changes the meaning of her mission. What if the person who tried to save the children the first time failed? What if the failure created the town? What if Tabitha is being pushed into repeating that same attempt? Then the question isn't, can Tabitha save them? The question is, can she save them without repeating the mistake? And that may be the difference between escaping from and becoming part of it forever. Now think about Julie. Her ability to interact with events across time may be the biggest clue of all. Because if Julie can move through the story, then she may be the first character who can see that events aren't isolated. She can witness moments that are connected. She can potentially understand cause and effect from outside the normal sequence. And that means Julie could eventually discover something everyone else has missed. The story isn't repeating randomly. It is repeating toward a specific moment. A moment where someone must make a choice that has been made before. And if Julie can reach that moment before it happens again, she may be able to change it. But here's the darker possibility. Maybe the town already knows she can. Maybe that's why her ability appeared. Maybe the town isn't giving her a weapon. Maybe it's testing her. Because if the cycle depends on certain roles being repeated, then a character who can move outside the timeline becomes extremely dangerous. And dangerous characters are exactly what the town tries to isolate. Which brings us back to the original question. Why does everyone forget? Because remembering isn't simply knowledge. Remembering is power. The people who remember the past can recognize the pattern. And people who recognize the pattern can stop playing their assigned role. That is why the story has spent so much time giving characters fragments instead of answers. The town doesn't fear ignorance. It fears complete understanding. And now the residents are getting dangerously close. Jade has the symbols. Tabitha has the children. Victor has the memories. Julie has the timeline. Boyd has the rules. And together, they may possess something none of them has alone. The complete story. But there is one final piece missing. The person who started it. Because if the children were sacrificed, someone made the choice. If the monsters were transformed, someone made the bargain. If the cycle began, someone created the first version. And if that person is still connected to the town, then the biggest villain may not be hiding outside the forest. They may be hiding inside the story itself. And when the residents finally remember who made the first choice, they may discover that the person responsible has been watching them repeat it all along. The person who started the story may not be the person we expected. Because if the entire town is built around one forgotten event, then someone had to make the first choice. Someone had to decide that the children could be sacrificed. Someone had to believe the bargain was worth making. Someone had to create the conditions that eventually became this nightmare. And this is where the entire mythology of From may finally lock into place. The monsters may not be the beginning. The children may not be the beginning. The town may not even be the beginning. The beginning was a choice. A human choice. A choice made because someone believed they could defeat death. And if that is true, then the most terrifying thing about From isn't that supernatural forces exist. It's that the supernatural forces may have been created by human desperation. Think about what the residents keep doing. Whenever they face something impossible, they try to control it. Boyd tries to establish rules. Jade tries to solve the mathematics. Tabitha tries to rescue the children. Victor tries to preserve memories. Sarah tries to understand the voices. Everyone is searching for a way to defeat the system. But every attempt at control seems to create another consequence. That may be the point. From may be telling one enormous story about people trying to escape death and creating something worse every time they try. This is why the monster's immortality matters. They don't simply survive. They are trapped. They are permanently transformed. They can walk forever. They can hunt forever. They can wait forever. But they cannot return to normal life. That is not immortality. That's punishment. And if the original people sacrificed the children to gain eternal life, then the monsters are living proof that the bargain worked in the worst possible way. They got exactly what they wanted. They just didn't understand the price. That would explain their smiles, their patience, their strange conversations with victims, their almost human behavior. They remember what it was like to be human, but they can never go back. And perhaps that is why the town keeps offering the same temptation to new people. Because the original bargain is still active. The system needs new participants, new fear, new suffering, new choices, new people who might eventually make the same mistake. And now the residents are approaching the same point. They are desperate. They have lost people. They are exhausted. They have watched impossible things happen. They are willing to do things they never would have considered before arriving. That's exactly when a bargain becomes dangerous. Because desperation makes impossible choices look reasonable. And that may be the real function of the town. Not simply to kill people. To break them until they are willing to choose the wrong solution. But here's what changes everything. What if the town has already found people capable of breaking the cycle? What if Jade, Tabitha, Victor, and Julie are not random survivors? What if they are the 4 pieces required to finally expose the original story? Think about what each character represents. Victor represents memory. He carries the past. Jade represents understanding. He refuses to accept unexplained patterns. Tabitha represents compassion and rescue. She is focused on the children. Julie represents time. She can interact with the story in a way the others cannot. Memory, understanding, rescue, time. Put those together, and you get something very close to a solution. But the town has one advantage. It doesn't need to defeat them all at once. It only needs to keep them separated. Make them distrust each other. Give them different information. Create new emergencies. Force them to choose survival over understanding. That's why chaos follows every breakthrough. Every time the characters begin putting the pieces together, something happens that demands immediate attention. A monster attack. A death. A disappearance. A new supernatural threat. A personal crisis. The mystery gets interrupted. And that may not be coincidence. The town's greatest defense is distraction. Because the only way to defeat a repeating story is to see the entire pattern. Not one scene. Not one symbol. Everything. And the residents have never been allowed to see everything at once. Until now. This is the detail everyone missed. The story has been teaching us the solution for years. The clues were never meant to be understood individually. The bottled tree doesn't solve from. The children don't solve from. The monsters don't solve from. The visions don't solve from. The reincarnations don't solve from. But together, they point toward one idea. The past is still happening. Not literally. Psychologically. Supernaturally. Narratively. The residents are living inside consequences that were never resolved. And that means the only way out may be to finish what the original people failed to finish. Not escape. Not kill the monsters. Not destroy the town. Finish the story. That is why the title, The Story Everyone Forgot, matters. Because the town doesn't need to hide the truth forever. It only needs to keep the truth incomplete. As long as the residents have fragments, they remain confused. As long as they remain confused, they repeat the same mistakes. And as long as they repeat the mistakes, the town survives. But once someone remembers the complete story, the rules change. And that is where Victor could become the most dangerous person in the entire town. Because Victor has been there long enough to remember what everyone else cannot. He may not understand everything, but he has seen patterns repeat. People arrive. People die. The monsters come. The trees move people. The children appear. The town changes. And then the cycle begins again. Victor may have spent his entire life thinking he survived by forgetting. But perhaps he actually survived because he remembered enough. Enough to avoid making the final choice. Enough to keep the cycle from consuming him completely. And now the younger residents are forcing the buried memories back into the open. That is why Victor's story suddenly feels connected to everyone else's. His past is not background information. It is the previous version of their present. And if that's true, then the biggest revelation may involve a sister. Not because she necessarily survived in the way people expect, but because her disappearance represents the first time Victor tried to understand the story. She left. She searched. She believed there was something outside the nightmare. And she became part of the town's forgotten history. Her story may contain another piece of the original pattern. A warning about what happens when someone gets too close. And that makes Victor's survival even more tragic. He didn't simply survive while everyone else died. He survived while forgetting why they died. Now, imagine what happens when he finally remembers. The emotional consequences would be enormous. Because Victor may realize that the people arriving now are repeating the same path as the people he knew as a child. Different faces. Same nightmare. Same trees. Same tunnels, same children, same monsters, and perhaps the same ending. Unless someone finally refuses to play the role. That may be the real purpose of the current group. They are not necessarily the strongest people who have ever entered from. They may be the first group capable of understanding the pattern together. And the town knows it, which explains the escalation. The threats are becoming more psychological. The rules are becoming less predictable. The characters are experiencing time differently. The supernatural events are becoming more connected. The closer they get to the truth, the more aggressively the town reacts. That's not because the mystery is getting bigger. It's because the mystery is getting exposed. And if the central theory is correct, then the final confrontation won't simply be Boyd versus the monsters. It won't be Jade versus the symbols. It won't be Tabitha versus the town. It will be the residents versus the story itself. They have to reach the moment where the original cycle began and make a different choice. That is the only thing the town may not be able to control. Because supernatural systems can manipulate people. They can manipulate memories. They can manipulate fear. They can manipulate time. But they cannot guarantee what a person chooses when they finally understand the truth. And that's why the final reveal could be devastating. The way out may have been available from the beginning. Not through the road. Not through the forest. Not through a magical door. Through memory. Remember who you were. Remember what happened. Remember why the children were sacrificed. Remember who made the bargain. Remember what the monsters used to be. Remember the mistake that created everything. And then don't repeat it. That may be the real solution to From. Not destroying the nightmare. Understanding it. Because the town survives when its victims believe they are trapped inside a random horror. The moment they realize they are inside a repeating story, the power shifts. They stop asking, what do we survive tonight? They start asking, what happened the first time? And that is the question the town has been terrified of. Because the first time contains the answer. The first sacrifice. The first bargain. The first transformation. The first failure. The first person who tried to break the cycle. And possibly, the first person who discovered how to end it. So maybe From was never really about a group of strangers trapped in a mysterious town. Maybe it was always about one unfinished story searching for an ending. The faces changed. The generations changed. The locations may have changed. But the roles remained. And now, for the first time, the people inside the story are beginning to remember that they have played these roles before. Which means the next step is terrifyingly simple. Someone has to refuse. Someone has to reach the children. Someone has to confront the original bargain. Someone has to remember the complete story. And someone has to make a different choice. Because if they fail, the cycle doesn't simply continue. It resets. New people arrive. New trees appear. New monsters walk into the darkness. New victims forget. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, the same story begins again. But if they succeed, then the town loses the one thing it has depended on for generations. Forgetfulness. And that leaves us with the darkest possibility of all. What if the story everyone forgot isn't the story of how From began? What if it's the story of how From ends? And if the characters finally remember who they were, will they discover that escaping the town was never the real goal? Maybe the real goal was to make sure the story could never happen again.